In this video, we'll get a virtual tour of our tide pools in Westport, Washington. Right now, we're high up on the rocks in the spray zone. From the highest high tide mark to the lowest low tide mark, we have the littoral or intertidal zone, where we see our limpets, our barnacles, mussels, chitons. And then below our lowest low tide zone, we have the sub-littoral zone or the subtidal zone, where we have our sea anemones, our sea stars, and our seaweeds. Here are our acorn barnacles. These are the most common barnacle in our mid to upper intertidal zone, and they can survive long periods outside of the water. They feed with cirri, hand-like projections that grasp for tiny food particles when they're underwater. Our thatched barnacles are some of our largest barnacles. They can grow up to 2 inches across and live up to 15 years, but they are often eaten by ochre sea stars. They live close to the low tide line and grow on rocks. Leaf barnacles are fairly unique looking. They attach to rocks and other objects by a strong rubbery stalk. This barnacle is a sessile suspension feeder, meaning it feeds from one place. It occurs on rocky coasts in the intertidal zone and favors exposed areas where there is a lot of wave action. Here is the Pacific plate limpet. They resemble a plate with how flat they are, and they move up and down with the tide, consuming microscopic and encrusting algae. They're nocturnal and can smell starfish and move away slowly. Here are the California mussels. They are much larger and more robust than the blue mussel, as you can see in comparison here. California mussels are blue-brown in color, and they grow much larger than the blue mussels. They filter feed, and they thrive in the pounding surf of open coasts, clinging to rocks and other mussels with tenacious byssal threads. Blue mussels are much smaller and less hardy than the California mussel. They are thin-shelled. They are also a filter feeder who feed on tiny particles in the water. They're found in more protected or calmer waters where there is low salinity. In the right conditions, they can be found growing next to the California mussels, as we saw in the last video. They attach themselves to rock and wood, especially pilings. Here is the purple shore crab. They are dark purple to reddish brown or green in color, and they have distinctive purple dots on their pincers. They're an herbivore that feeds on bits of algae. They emerge at night to feed, and they're very defensive and do not tend to be scared to pinch you. The striped shore crab is brown, purple, or black with a square carapace with green stripes. They eat green algae, red algae, brown seaweed, diatoms, worms, mussels, limpets, snails, even flies. They can stay above water for up to 70 hours, and they hide within small crevices between rocks, but will emerge at night when there is less danger of predation. Here is the hairy hermit crab. It has mostly brown with white and blue stripes on the appendages, which also have tiny little hairs on them. The antennas also have white stripes. They live in tide pools and rocky shores and scavenge for bits of plants and animals. Here is the giant green anemone that gets its color from the photosynthetic algae that live in the epidermis and tissue of the gut. They also have nematocytes found in the tentacles that allow the anemone to catch and paralyze prey. The anemone feeds on sea urchins, small fish, crabs, but detached mussels seem to be their main food source. These anemones tend to live a solitary life and can move slowly using their basal disc, but usually stay in the same place. The aggregating anemone is the most abundant species of sea anemone found in the rocky intertidal zone. It's olive to bright green with tentacles tipped in pink. The aggregating anemones host endosymbiotic photosynthetic algae along with dinoflagellates. When one colony of genetically identical polyps encounters a different genetic colony, the two will wage territorial battles. They attack the competing anemone with specific tentacles with stinging cells called nematocytes. This purple sea sponge is able to feed itself from its sedentary marine position just by pushing water through the oscula, which are the purple to pink in color raised pores on the surface of the sea sponge. It can live in both calm waters and places where there is intense wave action. It is primarily found on the undersides of rocks. The ochre sea star is identified as a keystone species, meaning that other species within the intertidal zone rely on it to survive or change the ecosystem. The tube feet have suckers on their distal ends which allow them to attach to the rocky substrate. As an adult, they feed on mussels, chitons, limpets, snails, and barnacles. They use their tube feet to handle their prey and then can invert their stomach through their mouth and engulf its prey, liquefying it with digestive enzymes. This sea slug is called the ring-spotted doris. It likes to live in the lower intertidal to subtidal zone on rocky shores, crevices, and seaweed. This is the tide pool sculpin. They can tolerate a wide range of conditions. They depend on camouflage for their protection. Their green-gray color will match the color of their home pool. They can grow up to 3 inches long and feed on small invertebrates such as isopods, amphipods, gastropods, worms, and barnacles. After getting swept away by the tide, they can return to their home pool. Here's the hairy chiton. This species is an omnivore. They feed on algae, bryozoans, hydroids, and other low-growing organisms. Their head is seen only as a partial head because they have no brain or eyes, but they are still responsive to possible predators and waves by creating suction or curling up in a ball. This darker chiton is called a black caddy chiton. Here is the feathered boa seaweed. It is light to dark brown in color, shiny and bumpy in texture, and may reach over 5 meters long. It has strap-like fronds that are lined with small blades, each a few centimeters long. There are pneumatocysts, or floats, at intervals along the fronds which provide buoyancy. It likes to live in the low intertidal to subtidal zone attached to rocks. Here is the winged kelp. It's one of the larger varieties of brown algae on the west coast. This kelp is nutritional and tasty in stir fries and soups. The Turkish towel seaweed is bright red when young and turns dark purple as it ages and appears almost black. It dies off during winter, and the holdfast stays in place for spring when it re-sprouts. It attaches to rocks in the intertidal zone and is an excellent source of carrageenan used in food for many applications. Sea lettuce is a group of edible green algae that is widely distributed. It is very common on rocks and other algae in the littoral and sublittoral zones. It is particularly prolific in areas where nutrients are abundant. This is iridescent seaweed. It is red-purple to yellow-brown in color. It is rubbery to the touch and iridescent underwater. It grows on rocks in sheltered waters in the mid to low intertidal and upper subtidal zones. Nailbrush seaweed is very common. It can appear dark red, purple, or brown. Tiny creatures crawl in them for shelter. They prefer the very high reaches of the shore where it clings to rocks. It dries out in the sun and resaturates with the ocean mist at high tide. Rockweeds have fronds that are fairly rigid, partially flattened, and olive green to yellowish green in color. At the end of each frond is a swollen receptacle that floats in the water. Its presence increases species richness as it forms canopies in the mid to high intertidal zone that provide protection, shelter, and food for a variety of small invertebrates, including many gastropods and crustaceans. This is the end of our virtual tide pool tour. Thanks for joining us.